Hi, this is Eric Stano with Magic Ed Tech, and this is our podcast series, Tech in Ed Tech. Today I'm joined by Sam Nelson, the Director of Technical Curriculum at Multiverse. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So why don't we just get started and give our listeners a chance to get to know you a little bit. So could you share a little bit about your background and your journey through ed tech? And then bring us up to your current role and what you do at Multiverse.
Sure. I'll start kind of at the beginning when I first got interested. So I started
Please.
my career as a data analyst for a consulting firm. We did analysis for big corporate litigation cases where we estimated damages. And so I studied economics and I went to a company that did economics. And then I had to learn how to code and do a bunch of things and thought, man, I spent all this time in school and now I'm still going through a painful training process at a new company. And I thought there should be better ways to do this. So after a brief stint at a small B2B software company, I decided to go back to school. I got an MBA and Master's in Education joint program at the University of Virginia, and then started working at Udacity. I got really excited about the alternative higher education or lifelong learning space, given my experience entering the workforce and having to learn how to code. So I worked on their data programs for about 3.5 years. So went from one data program to 7 programs, and from a few $1 million a year to a $20+ million kind of book of business in that area of Udacity. Mm-hmm. Now that was a tumultuous time there. We survived like 5 rounds of layoffs and 7 bosses and decided it was time to move on to something else. I joined Chegg as in their boot camp arm called Thinkful to run their instructional design arm of their product team. And there we built out new boot camps and kind of expanded on their model. Then was recruited away. At my heart, I love data. So I was recruited away to come lead product at a small data science learning company called DataQuest. Very cool company. I was there for a few years before a brief stint at a company called Ziplines Education, where I consulted on some new program creation, before I landed at Multiverse, where I'm one of their 3 directors of technical curriculum. And here at Multiverse, I'm working on building out their kind of U.S. Curriculum offering. So it's a UK-based company that's done a lot of apprenticeships, and that's how they've built their business. And now they have a much smaller presence in the U.S., and so we're trying to figure out how to go to market in the U.S. and address the unique needs of this geography versus the UK market.
Very nice, very nice. And one of the reasons I think that we've come together today is conversations that you have had with my colleagues, specifically in your role but drawing on your experience at multiple companies, but around the challenge of integrating platform, curriculum, and support in your current role. Can you give us some insights into how you sort of maintain consistency in learning experiences across different platforms, different support systems? What sort of strategies do you recommend for ensuring learners, from your vantage point, have a cohesive and effective learning experience, regardless of the delivery method?
Yeah, there's a couple of frameworks that I use to help guide my decision making here, and it's helpful when I talk to other people that lays the foundation for how to integrate these things. So the first one is understanding the difference between a true technology company that sells education technology versus what I would call a tech-enabled school, which doesn't actually sell technology, it sells a learning experience. And the 2 approaches for those 2 types of companies is quite different. If I'm what I would call a true education technology company, I'm selling technology and I'm selling it to education institutions. And so it's really focused on that technology being the product. Now, if you are a tech-enabled school, which is still often just referred to as education technology, you're selling a learning experience, and that the technology is not the end goal. The technology enables the learning experience. And so I call these learning products. Right. So a learning product is something that is a learning experience, essentially. And so that's where you want to integrate the platform or the technology part of the learning experience, the curriculum. So it's actually like the learning goals and
Uh-huh.
what content and what other types of learning methods you use to achieve those goals. And then what do they do when they get stuck, right? Like what type of support? And that support can be automated. It can be in person. It can be remote and live. There's lots of different support models. But when you're thinking about your learning experience, it's the integration of those three things. And so when you're thinking about your product roadmap, you need to think about how those three things work together,
Right.
and then making sure that your product roadmap reflects those three things. So let me give you an example.
Sure.
So if I'm going to create a new program, for example, that often is just on the curriculum team or the learning. We call it the learning team. But
Uh-huh.
I've had the content team, the instructional design team, the learning team, all the same thing. And that's on the learning team's roadmap. Now, if it's on the learning team's roadmap, it also has to be often on the platform team's roadmap and the support team's roadmap. So I can't really make a roadmap of stuff I want to build on the learning team without integrating with those teams. So for example, if I want to create a new program on data engineering and I'm going to teach a new technology, so that means on the platform we need to integrate that technology into the platform so it'll enable the learning. And then on the support team, we now need to hire a different type of coach, or we need to, if we have an AI, we need to upload a different set of content and train that AI model to support on this content. And so you really have to have this joint roadmap. Where this breaks down is when these teams have separate priorities and separate KPIs
Right.
that they hit. And so I see this challenge, especially with like platform and curriculum. Often because at a ed tech company or what I call a tech enabled school, the product team is really in charge of the platform. And then
Yes.
we forget that the curriculum is also a product team and operates like a product team. And
That's right.
so both teams are like, well, we're the product. Well, we're the product. Well, it's like, no, you both are the product.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and so that really the most important thing there is that the leadership is bought into that idea that it's the combination of the two, and that they're not territorial and trying to secure resources for themselves, but instead think about, what are we really trying to build as a company and how do we get the right people working on the right things.
And you invoked the fact that each cohort has its own KPIs, its own roadmap, and certainly having the leadership of each team uh, bought in to sort of similar goals, the same goals, is important. Are there other tips even beyond leadership and having KPIs that align that you would give to others to foster some collaboration among those teams?
Yes, absolutely. So, leadership, very important that they're aligned. At the next level, you think about what a product manager does, the equivalent of a product manager on the curriculum side. We call them technical curriculum leads.
Uh-huh.
Previous companies, we've called them product leads. When you think about your role as leading a product team, to think about, well, how does support play into this team, and if I'm, for example, if I'm a product manager on the platform side, so I've primarily worked with designers and engineers. Well, if you have a project you're working on, it's like, well, how should I incorporate learning science and learning design into this? Because right now, for example, our product team doesn't have a ton of learning experience, but we have a ton on the learning team. So how do we incorporate that? Where do we need them? And then how do we, and also involve the support side of things? So one of the products we're working on right now for our new subscription product is group coaching, right? So we want to have groups of 2 to 6 people in these small group coaching sessions. Well, how we design the product should certainly be influenced by the capabilities we have on our support team, or we call it our delivery team. And then also like, well, how do we structure that from a learning science perspective? Like what content should we cover in there? How much of it
Right.
how do we structure open-ended questions? How do we enable like a really high quality coaching session? What does that even mean? Well, the product team doesn't actually have that expertise. So as a product manager, make sure you're no longer working with just engineers and designers. You're also working with learning designers and coaches.
Right.
Same thing on the learning side. If I'm building a new course, it's, well, what platform features would enable the ideal learning experience here? And how do I need to involve our engineering or product and design team to enable that? So I think thinking about a product pod is no longer just being the typical product manager, engineer, designer, product designer. You also have sort of a broader group of people.
Right. And you invoked here, I want to shift gears ever so slightly, but I think you gave us a good jumping off point there. You mentioned sort of those who actually are designing the curriculum, or the curricula rather. And, one of the challenges we know, I've seen it from my own perch, and I'm sure you've seen it, is that curriculum designers often face challenges in balancing industry specific skills training and maintaining pedagogical integrity. How do you address the specific challenges and requirements of each sector, such as data engineering versus product management? How do you thread that kind of needle?
Yeah, that's a challenging one. So just to reiterate the challenge I've seen is each of these of the education companies I've worked at, and then I've seen many others, is they start off in one area that they see a lot of success in. So a typical example is like a coding boot camp. And they're like, oh, we found a model for coding boot camp. They do X, Y, Z. And at the end, they have a portfolio of things, and then they present it and get jobs. Right. And they're like, well, let's expand to the next thing and the next thing. And you slowly get less similar to your original product. And so now let's say you're doing a product management. Now, product management is incredibly collaborative.
Right.
And so the approach you take to a good learning experience needs to be very different, because you can't just have an engineer coding things. I mean, engineering is collaborative too, but it's a lot easier to build something by yourself that's valuable in isolation. But you can't be a good product manager unless you learn how to, work with other people and not just engineers and designers, but also other stakeholders. And so, thinking about those balance is one is being okay about just saying, you know what, we don't have the capabilities internally to do this. And we did that. Two companies, we were like, we should do cybersecurity. And then we started to explore it, and then we decided we can't do it well, because we need to integrate these kind of labs and simulating environments. And we'd have to make a big engineering investment that it just wasn't worth it. So I think that's
a tough call to make too, when you're committed to the enterprise to say, okay, that's maybe not for us.
Yeah, especially in a field that's as big as cybersecurity and as much money is getting invested there.
Right. It's growing and growing, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one tip is be okay about saying no if you can't do it well. For example, if you want to do product management, but you're an completely asynchronous platform, it's like, well, be clear on what the learning outcomes that you can help people achieve. You can teach people a lot about product management in an async environment, but you can't really say they're going to be job ready at the end. But if you have, if you're doing something that has more, social learning and live cohorts and things like that, well, then you can put people in groups and have them do group projects that simulate better the product management. So I think as this comes down to what I'll call a learning product manager, somebody who's a product manager over a learning experience, we call them, again, technical curriculum leads. That's ultimately their role, to understand, hey, this is my audience and this is the needs of this audience. Here are the learning objectives. And, they'll work with learning designers as well as like, what are the requirements of this type of person for these types of learning objectives? And choosing the right learning activities that are appropriate for those learning objectives. And so it's even less about, data engineering versus product management, because there'll be certain learning objectives or learning outcomes that they want to achieve that overlap. But so it's down at that level, right? If you want to learn how to conduct a retro meeting, well, that's going to be tough to do by watching a video.
Sure.
At least it's going to be tough. I should say it's tough to practice while watching a video, versus you got to learn how to build the data pipeline. Well, you can do that pretty easily in a async environment.
Sure.
So anyway, those are some thoughts about that.
Yeah, and you've given some examples of different types of learning that are more easily executed, harder to ape in that kind of context. I want to sort of drill into, uh, I'm going to say specific, but then be sort of not specific, but technical skills, broadly speaking. You began to invoke this a little bit. Technical skills are best learned in context. What methods do you use to integrate real world scenarios into your curriculum? If you have any examples of areas where you consider that really successfully executed in the past, it'd be great to hear.
That's a great question, because I think if you look at any learning platform, they talk about all their real world stuff,
Right.
but it's very difficult to do in a true real world context. Projects are huge for this, and
Hmm.
you design. One of the core principles of learning design is backward design, which
Sure.
you've heard the term, right?
Of
Where you
course.
say, here are your learning outcomes, here are your learning objectives. Now, would one assess whether someone's achieved that? Well, let's create the assessment first, and that's the project, right? I think assessments
Right.
are. You can also do quizzes and exams and things like that are helpful, but ultimately, a project is a demonstration of someone's skills. And projects across sectors can look very, very different. And then
Right.
when I work with people who build projects, my steer is always think about what someone would actually do on the job, right? And just have them do that, right? And actually, you can scope your whole course by just saying, well, what do we want them to learn? Well, what would they do on the job? Well, let's have them do that. Um,
Right.
and so, examples of where this, and broadly speaking, that seems straightforward enough. And then as you get into it, it can be kind of hard. Some examples of where I think that this is worked well for technical skills. For data analysis, for
Uh-huh.
example, teaching how to do, I mean, this is more like data science, but building models, for example, is often what you'll get is if you learn how to build a machine learning model, it's like a very, very clean data set. It's ready to go. You just throw it into Python and create a predictive model. But a real world context is usually some sort of like messy data set that lives in 16 different places, and you got to put it.
Of course. I'm familiar. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we've, in the past at Udacity, we tried to do that with a couple of other projects where it's like, well, yeah, here's data across a few different things that's incomplete. And so first you got to put it all together and identify what are the right features to use in your predictive model. One thing that I think Multiverse does really well, because they built their whole business on apprenticeships, and so their projects are a little less. They're very different than the other ones I worked on in the past, where rather than saying, okay, here's a scenario that's, it might be tied to a real company or a make believe thing, where here's a scenario where you get to practice and demonstrate your skills. And for Multiverse, it's here's what you've learned. Here's a project brief that you can use to go find a project at your company that your boss is going to be happy with you doing.
Interesting.
And that's going to use the skills that you just learned. Now go and do that and come back to us and show us what you did and reflect on it. And so if that type of project, you might not have the same level of like very specific rubric criteria that you need to pass off, but it helps with learning transfer, which is one of the most important things in learning.
Of course.
Is where you can learn it,
And
internalize it,
apply it.
and apply it and transfer it to a new context, right? So a lot of the time we apply it to these real world scenarios that aren't necessarily our context. And then we go back to work and we think, oh, well, how would I do that?
Right.
One of my favorite learning experiences, which is why I got into this apprenticeship space in the first place, is I did my first year of grad school in the full-time like residential program at Darden at UVA's business school.
Uh-huh.
Then I joined Udacity and stayed on during my summer internship. And so then I did my second year in their executive program. What I loved about their executive program is I'd be learning something on a Friday. Like took this pricing class, and we learned about this specific survey technique to estimate willingness to pay. And essentially you can plot a demand curve and pick the right price. A very cool technique. And so I learned it on Friday, and then I did it on Wednesday, and then presented the results and pricing suggestions, the next day to my boss.
Oh, nicely done, Udacity.
Yeah. So it was great that I had learning that I got to apply in context. And so
Of
now
course.
that like really solidified the learning because I had that opportunity to transfer. So I think that if you can help people say, all right, I learned this in the course. Now here are the tips and tricks and ways that you can go find a project of work to go do that. I think that's powerful.
And it had a little just-in-time nature to it too, the learning, which is great. The
Right.
pace at which you were applying it was persuasive. Actually, speaking of pacing, technological change is quick. And when you're there's a course that is on technical skills, those gaps in those skills can emerge quickly if the technology's outpacing uh, outpacing you. How do you ensure that your curriculum is agile enough to address any skills gaps that might emerge without compromising the quality of the training you're giving?
So this is a challenging problem, and I don't think
Certainly.
any company I've worked at that we totally nailed it.
Hmm.
I One thing we're actually working on right now that we've tackled this in past companies too is just when you're building a roadmap, how do you incorporate maintenance? And so you have maintaining your content, especially as you expand your content
Right.
portfolio, becomes a challenge. And it's always easier to say, well, I can predict, like I can build this new thing and I know that there'll be some revenue that comes from it and growth,
Uh-huh.
but I can't really predict how maintaining this content is going to help. So, which one are you going to prioritize? You're always going to prioritize the new thing. So it requires some organizational discipline to
Hmm.
make sure that you're investing in keeping your content up to date. So I think that's part of the question you're asking is like, look, I have a way.
It's precisely it. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like I have a data analytics curriculum. How do I make sure that that is teaching the latest and greatest?
Right. Right. So
And
there's a nurture element to the
yeah,
existing portfolio that you want to make sure is funded and privileged to a degree, but the center of gravity is always going to shift towards the new thing. But you have to make sure to balance the two. Is that sort of a fair restatement of what you're suggesting?
yeah, exactly. And just you have to be willing to carve out some resources to do that.
Right.
I've
Right.
seen, and then especially if you can align your new curriculum to be supplementing your existing curriculum. For example, we have a data analytics curriculum, and now we're working on an AI for data analysts,
Sure.
like add on to that. So it's a way that we can both kind of capture new revenue, but also be investing in our current programs. So we can make those things aligned. That's a good thing.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but and you have to keep track of your metrics, right? If particularly your outcome, I think about metrics as you have your learning outcomes, which is how well do they achieve the goals you set out for them in the course, and then the career outcomes is like what happens now after they go take those to market.
Right.
And so we keep track of that by what happens to our apprentices after they complete the program. Do they get promoted? Do they stay on with their companies and all of those things? That's a lagging metric, but keeping track of those metrics can help you understand when you need to make investments in your programs.
No, no, very, very persuasive. And you mentioned outcomes, and this is a related question, but you know, obviously, for most, a personalized learning experience is going to be the most effective one for them. But that's hard to scale in any sort of large organization or with a product or a platform or a course that is meant to speak to many people. How do you approach, if you do, personalized learning? And how do you, if you do, how do you do that at scale?
Yeah, this is actually pretty exciting for what we're working on in Multiverse because this
Nice.
is core to our investment into, especially in the U.S. market. So we think about this. I think about this in two ways. First of all, when we work with an organization, we want to customize or at least configure a program to meet the goals of the company. So we have this process we have people go through. We call it diagnose, prescribe, treat.
Hmm.
So the diagnose part is, well, what are your goals? We ask a leader, what are your goals? And have them go through a few questions. And then we recommend a pathway of learning modules, essentially, that they would have their learners go through, based on their goals. And then they can look at the pathway and say, oh, we want to add this, remove this. And so that they get their own pathway that's specific to their company goals, as opposed to, oh yeah, here's our data analysis pathway. So you could have your data analysis. You could also add some AI to it. You could add a little data engineering to it. So you can, based on what you need, and to your tech stack, right? You could, if you want Excel versus you want Tableau, and then so that what I call, actually refer to that as customization. Then the next level is personalization. So with each individual learner, they have different set of skills, and rather than having everybody go through the same thing, we have them go through what we call a skill scan. It's not just like a pre-assessment in the sense of like testing their skills. It's also just asking them, like, how comfortable do you feel with these things? Do you have experience with this? And so it's helping them craft and personalize that pathway to them. So everybody has the same set of goals, but then you basically say, well, I already know X, Y, and Z. So I just to focus on what they need to learn.
Right.
So that's one level of like the customization for the company's goals, personalization by learner. And then, back to the project idea that I had mentioned, they get to have some say in the type of project that they do and go take that to work.
Nice.
And then we're also working with one of our early customers. Is they're like, well, we want everybody to go through this AI curriculum, but we have like 14 different business units. Can you do a project for each business unit? And we're like, sure, let's do that. And so each person has the same learning objectives, but they have a slightly different project for their business unit that's going to apply most to them. So that learning transfer is the goal.
Right, and that's a sort of a perfect jumping off point for another question I had on the personalization front. I presume you have a global audience, and you've talked of customization. How do you go about customizing, if it's actually any different than you do for different departments or different companies? Customizing for different regions of the world, particularly when there are cultural differences that might impact how the material is received or understood. Is there a play that you have there?
Yeah, Multiverse is primarily in the UK and now entering the US market. So those audiences aren't as different as they could be if we had different regions.
Technically, that is global, though.
Yeah, it is global though. One funny thing though is I learned here is originally we wrote our curriculum in using British English. So customization, for example, had an S instead of a Z.
That's certainly.
And people in the U.S. can read that, but turns out people in the U.S. don't like that very much.
No, that in the proliferation, rather, they'll cut that out of editing, of use in a variety of words.
Yeah, and so we've actually, but it turns out people in the UK don't care if it's US English, just because I think a lot of people around the world are used to that with all the tech companies and the products that they use. So we've changed everything to use US because it's more broadly accepted. And that's kind of a specific funny example, but the idea is that we try to remove the unnecessary cultural references, or especially like pop culture, like we stay away from that to make sure that, especially people who English is not their first language, that people understand it. That's definitely a principle. One of our corporate, we have this MAGE framework, which is measure, applied, guided, and equitable. One of the things with equitable is using language that's
meaningful to everyone.
Yeah. Meaningful to everyone. We are looking at different regions in the world that and including localization of language, which should be an interesting next step for us. But right now, that hasn't been a big problem for us to solve. So it has, I can't say much more.
Sure. No, understood. Well, then sort of switching gears a little bit, you talked earlier about, we talked earlier about, sometimes privileging the new course or product over the existing one, the one where we spoke about sort of nurturing it and updating it as one goes. But on the one that gets privileged a bit, which is the new, when you're pitching a new curriculum initiative to the various stakeholders, you've got to demonstrate an ROI to them. How do you go about communicating, measuring the return on investment for your training programs? You've already invoked a bit about pursuing uh, people's placement and sort of careers post these training programs. Could you talk a little bit about, again, how you go about making that pitch for a new initiative and how you reflect on the ROI?
Yes, absolutely. So I'd mentioned this earlier, but I'll reiterate it because I think it's important. So I think there's two types of outcomes. First, there's learning outcomes, which is how well they do in the learning program. And then there are career outcomes, which is what impact does that have on the career? Or
Sure.
in this case, if it's with a company, it's like, what impact does that have on the business? So for learning outcomes, though they're easier to measure, but slightly less important. But they are really important, though, in terms of, hey, look, you're going to, put 500 people through this program. This is a program where 80% people typically finish, right? Versus something like, I'm one of the MOOCs, one of the just asynchronous online courses may have 5% completion. So it's like, if you're going to invest in something, you want to have it be something that people finish. And so that's an important one. How many people engage with it and finish it, how they do on their assessments, those types of things. The completion rate ends up being sort of the most important one that clients want to see, just because they want to see realistically what impact can they expect. And then the next one is, okay, well, what is the impact? What's that? Essentially, what's the learning transfer? Like, how does this affect the next step? So we use a lot of case studies because it's tough to every company has different goals with their learning. So it's tough to say across the board, we saw this.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a lot of, companies that talk about what the impact was on from the program, what they saw in their apprentices, what that drove for their business. And we have some other metrics about the percentage of apprentices that stay on with their companies, which is above 90%. The percentage of apprentices that get promoted or get a raise within a certain number of months after the program. And just to show that, hey, look, these other companies, they put people through and then they really value these apprentices after they finish their programs, because that, presumably they're having an impact and doing a good job. We also have some estimate of the number of revenue dollars that our programs have helped drive for companies. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure how we get to that number, but I know it is something that that's when I mentioned measure applied. Measured is that one where we really are trying to get into that ROI of what these programs do for people. It's to your point, it is pretty tough to quantify sometimes, but we do our best to dig into it, because that's part of the whole diagnose step of the diagnose, prescribe, treat. Is okay. Well, we don't want to just give you a generic program or sign you up for a platform. It's like, well, what are your goals? Let's start there. And then we're going to put together the best learning experience we can that'll help drive your goals.
So we've invoked this a couple of times throughout the course of the conversation, but change is always present and is always increasing in its rapidity. How do you stay up to date on technology changes and innovation? Are there specific sources, go-to sources that you use that you'd recommend to our listeners for, again, staying up to date, particularly when it comes to workforce learning?
Yeah, that's a good one. And so honestly, one of my favorite resources for this is the Slack channels at my company.
Invoking the conversation we had prior to recording, wherein I expressed my displeasure with Slack, but go ahead.
Yeah. People are always sharing really great articles. And so, and I would expand that to even my network on LinkedIn. It's as funny as it is to say that that's the primary source. It actually is a really good filtering mechanism than versus just like having a bunch of different publications that I go to regularly. I have some people I follow on LinkedIn that I think do a good job, and I could actually pull up a couple of their names. One in particular does another ed tech podcast. So I'll pitch ed tech podcast is a good source. It is a good way to do it. But yeah, I honestly think that the best way is to follow some individuals that post good content, because it's a natural curating mechanism for finding what's newest and what's the latest and greatest.
Right. No, and as aggrieved as I am to hear that Slack is the answer to that, and nothing against Slack, it's a wonderful product, wonderful tool, wonderful company. But I just personally get a little overwhelmed by it. But I think it's actually a very practical suggestion for folks.
Well, it's just like email is. Sometimes it can be a necessary evil because you need it. It has value, but it can be noisy.
Right, right. And actually, just relative to staying up to date, and again, we've touched on this a bit, but how do you ultimately strike a balance between incorporating new tech in your curriculum while ensuring that the content itself remains practical? You've invoked this immediately applicable for your learners in a day to day in their day to day roles. How do you go about striking that balance?
So I try to not chase the shiny thing just because it's the new shiny thing, right? You see a lot of that right now with all the new AI technologies.
Of course.
That everybody has an AI tutor, but not everyone is thinking intentionally about how that would be actually integrated in the learning experience. Like when would they prompt someone to use that AI tutor, and what should they ask them? How should they be using it? I think every learning experience should have one, but also should think about like, well, okay, great. Instead of just writing a reflection piece, like write a reflection piece and post it in your AI tutor, and ask it something. So I'm going down a rabbit hole, but the idea here is thinking about learning first, right? What is the objective of your learning, and then what are the right learning activities to achieve and assess that activity. So, for example, a really cool tool that we're using right now that is like a new shiny thing is this tool called Udly. So you can have a conversation with an AI, and you can kind of give it a prompt about the role it plays, and then you have a full conversation, and then it will kind of grade your conversation based on certain criteria. So the example that I saw in the demo was somebody giving feedback to an employee that was kind of hostile. And so they had to handle this angry AI, figure out what to say to calm it down. And then it gave that person feedback on how they did it. Basically gave feedback on how they provided feedback and handled a difficult situation, which I think is a huge unlock in terms of being able to help people develop durable soft skills in an asynchronous environment in a scalable way. So that's an example of when you do want to lean into the tool, the new shiny tool, because it's an unlock.
Right.
Versus, like if you're going to teach somebody coding, you actually probably don't want to use the AI autocomplete coding at first. That's a cool tool, but like that's actually going to maybe give them a crutch on how to learn. You probably should just stick to the basics.
Right.
And so really it's like thinking learning objective first, what's going to help them with learning transfer. And then saying, all right, what is the best tool? Well, it might be a new tech, it might not.
Right. And actually, you mentioned hostility, although it was relative to the AI's responses. But speaking of hostility, introducing new technologies, methods can sometimes be met by folks with resistance or hostility. Particularly the learners or instructors who are used to employing more traditional methods or methods that are well worn for them. How have you managed that kind of resistance or even hostility? What strategies have you found effective in encouraging adoption of new technologies in whatever way that is meaningful?
Yeah. So when I've hired and trained dozens of different content creators,
Mm-hmm.
and they come from all sorts of different backgrounds. So sometimes they're a subject matter expert who's never taught anything. Sometimes they're a teacher who doesn't know as much about technology,
Right.
and everywhere in between.
Right.
And so everybody brings their own perspective. And so you kind of need to meet them where they're at. And so there's really two main methods I've used. One is helping them understand the science behind what we're doing, right? So that for a teacher, it might be helping them understand the importance of engagement and user behavior approaches that you would typically see in like a technology product, and like how we integrate that with learning. They may say, well, that's not best practices for learning. Well, it's like if we don't get them to actually to really invest in the course, then they're not going to learn anything either. So it's like this balance of learning and engagement. And so spending some time, or vice versa, if you're talking with somebody who is teaching somebody how to code, you need to talk to them about expert blind spot and be like, I know that you feel like everybody should already know this, but they don't.
Right.
And so we need to think about scaffolding and sort of helping them understand the principles of learning science. So it's kind of like a teaching thing about helping them understand the principles. The second part is helping them understand that they're not just solving needs for a learner, they're solving needs for a business.
Right.
And that when you're building a learning experience, we can't provide that learning experience unless we provide it in a way that will have people paying for it. And so that's things like, well, not making the program too long. It's like, well, we need it to be a little bit shorter because otherwise people won't buy it. So how do we cut out any unnecessary, valuable, but not crucial content to make this thing shorter?
Right.
And so, I mean, that's less about new learning technologies and more about like helping them understand, be on board with our approach.
I think you just kind of led us to a pretty good place, which is really just sort of your part. And Sam, I want to thank you for joining today and really reflecting on all of your experiences and best practices and how you navigate really an ever changing landscape. Are there parting thoughts that you would want to leave with our listeners just on the future of learning experiences within EdTech and your sector of it in particular?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the elephant in the room is AI is going to continue to have a massive impact.
Certainly.
And we don't know exactly where that's going to go or how deep and how much it'll change everything. But I think it's going to continue to unlock new opportunities for learning. So I think my advice is similar. I mentioned earlier is think about the learning first and the goals first and how AI enables that versus, hey, cool new tech with AI. Let's figure out we have a solution. Let's go find a problem to solve. Like stick with problems first. Which is big. And that goes to the industry too. When you're working with customers or individuals, think about the problems they have or I like the jobs to be done framework, right? What job are they hiring you to do?
Mm-hmm.
And do that really well. And part of that with industry is really understanding the needs of the industry and staying close to that. So I think that's an important one, to think of yourself as partners with your customers. And to really understand their needs when you bring solutions to them. So it's been a pleasure to be on the podcast. I really appreciate the invite.
No, absolutely. So thank you again, Sam Nelson, Director of Technical Curriculum at Multiverse. I appreciate your time, your insights. There were many. This has been Tech in EdTech. Thank you for listening.